The garage is quiet. A 1964 Pontiac GTO sits in the corner, half in the light and half in the shade. It looks simple, just an old car resting after years of being used. The walls are worn, the floor has oil marks, and dust moves through the light in slow little waves. It feels like the kind of place you've walked into before without thinking. The GTO wasn't supposed to be a big deal. GM had rules, meetings, limits, all the usual things. And a car like this didn't really fit inside that system. But a few people at Pontiac kept going anyway. No big speeches, no big rebellion. Just engineers doing what felt right for the drivers they understood. Sometimes that's how things start. Before we continue, I remember seeing an old picture in a family album. A GTO parked outside a small house. A man standing next to it with a relaxed smile. Not posing, not showing off, just comfortable, like the car was part of his day. Sorry, we went off the topics, so let's back to the topic. So we were on the small group inside Pontiac who decided to build this car. The GTO arrived without any noise, no big ad campaign, no special launch. Just a car that showed up at the perfect moment for people who wanted something that felt a little stronger under their foot. Something that felt honest on the road. This garage, this soft light, this still air. It matches how the GTO really began. Nothing polished, nothing staged. Just a quiet idea that grew because people liked how it felt when it moved. And maybe that's why it stayed important for so long. The early 1960s in America looked calm on the surface. Families were moving into new suburbs, streets were filling with mid-size cars, and every company was focused on comfort and safety. Nobody was talking about speed, at least not in boardrooms. Inside General Motors, things were controlled by strict rules. GM was the biggest automaker in the world, and when a company gets that big, everything becomes a process. Paperwork, limits, approvals, all of it designed to keep every division in line. One of those limits said no mid-size car could have an engine bigger than 330 cubic inches. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the kind of rule that didn't move, no matter who complained. Pontiac, at the time, wasn't known for performance. It was seen as a comfortable, middle-choice brand. Nothing risky, nothing loud. But that started to change when Seaman "Bunky" Knutson stepped in as general manager. He looked around and realized the company was drifting behind Ford and Chrysler. Something needed to change. Then came a young engineer with a sharp mind and a different approach, John DeLorean. He didn't look like the usual GM manager. He was taller, more confident, more willing to try something new. And he paid attention to how young Americans were thinking. Outside Detroit, the culture was shifting. Teenagers had more freedom, more interest in cars, more desire to drive something that felt alive. Drag strips were getting crowded on weekends. People were talking about horsepower in diners and parking lots. It wasn't corporate, but it was real. Pontiac could see the change happening, but GM's rules made it almost impossible to respond. Inside Pontiac, engineers like Bill Collins and Russ G. were experimenting quietly. They understood something simple. People wanted a car that felt fun, not just safe or soft or predictable. A car that made the road feel a little different. Meanwhile, DeLorean watched all of this with interest. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. He was just paying attention to what people actually wanted. And what they wanted wasn't another family cruiser. There was also pressure from other companies. Ford had the youthful image. Chrysler had performance history. Pontiac had none of that yet. DeLorean knew Pontiac couldn't keep playing it safe, so he encouraged his engineers to think more boldly, quietly, inside small rooms, away from the rulebook. What would happen if someone simply put the larger 389 cubic inch engine into the mid-size Tempest? It wasn't legal under GM rules, but technically, it could still be packaged as an option. No new car, no new model, just a checkbox on an order sheet. That one loophole changed everything. During this time, America itself was restless. Music was changing, fashion was changing, and the idea of what a normal life looked like was starting to shift. People were frustrated with slow decisions from big organizations. They wanted things that felt more personal, including the cars they drove. And while GM saw a chart full of limits, Pontiac saw an opportunity. A small one, a quiet one, but still an opportunity. Pontiac's team kept testing the idea in the background. They didn't know if it would work. They didn't know if GM leadership would shut it down immediately. They only knew young drivers were asking for something different. The culture inside Pontiac was also changing. Younger engineers were joining. People were tired of making cars that all felt the same. There was a kind of quiet hunger to prove they could do more. And that's where the GTO's foundation began. Not on a racetrack, not in a marketing meeting, but inside a company trying to understand a new generation. The rules were still in place. The risks were still real. But something had shifted in the building. You could feel it in the way people talked, the way they tested engines, the way they stayed late to keep experimenting. Pontiac wasn't trying to break the industry. They were just trying to make something that felt right for the moment America was entering. And sometimes, a moment like that needs the right car. This was the world the GTO was born into. A strict company, a restless culture, and a small team inside Pontiac trying to push through both at the same time. Inside Pontiac, the real work didn't happen in boardrooms. It happened in small offices, cluttered workshops, and late-night talks between a few engineers who felt the company was falling behind. These were the people who shaped the GTO long before the world knew the name. Bill Collins was one of them. A practical engineer, calm, focused, not the type to make noise. He understood parts, numbers, and how to quietly make things fit where they weren't supposed to. He kept asking himself a simple question. What if we try the 389 in the Tempest? Russ Gee worked close to him. He wasn't loud either. He cared about the mechanical feel, how the engine behaved, how the car responded when you pressed the pedal. He could sense when something felt right, even before charts confirmed it. And then there was John DeLorean. He walked differently, talked differently. He didn't sound like a traditional GM leader. He noticed things others ignored, like what younger drivers wanted and why they didn't feel connected to GM's safer, quieter cars. When Collins and Gee brought him the idea, he didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for big presentations. He didn't need a full report. He just said, "Do it." That moment wasn't dramatic. It was quick, almost casual. But sometimes a small yes changes everything. Pontiac's team didn't celebrate. They got to work quietly. They pulled a Tempest into the workshop and started figuring out how to place the 389 under its hood without changing the body or drawing attention from upper management. They weren't trying to break rules. They were trying to build a car that finally felt alive. While they worked, the culture around them was shifting. Teenagers were buying records, filling diners, and crowding small drag strips on weekends. America was restless, and young drivers wanted something that didn't feel like their parents' cars. Something louder, but not reckless. Something powerful, but still familiar. Inside that Pontiac workshop, the engineers could feel this change, even though no executive memos ever mentioned it. They talked about cars the way people talk about memories, what the engine felt like at 30 miles per hour, what it sounded like when it first turned over, what it meant to build something people might actually connect with. During all this, marketing manager Jim Wangers started hearing quiet rumors about the project. Wangers wasn't an engineer, but he understood emotion. He knew how a car could make someone feel before they even drove it. When he learned a big-engine Tempest was being tested in the back rooms, he knew Pontiac had something special on their hands. Before going deeper, I remember meeting someone years ago who kept an old GTO key on his keychain, even though he hadn't owned the car in decades. He said the sound of that engine stayed in his mind for years. Not because it was loud, but because it felt like a part of him growing up. Sorry we went off the topic, so let's go back to the topic. So we were on Wangers discovering the early GTO testing. When Wangers finally saw the test car, he noticed something the engineers didn't focus on, how the car looked when it moved. He saw the attitude, the stance, the presence. It wasn't just an engine in a mid-size body. It was a message, and that message was simple. This car is for people who want to feel something when they drive. As testing continued, the team faced small problems, heat issues, suspension tweaks, carburetor tuning, nothing unusual. But no matter how many adjustments they made, the core idea stayed strong. The car felt good, honest, direct. The sort of car that didn't try too hard, yet carried its own confidence. Pontiac's engineers kept everything quiet, not because they were hiding, but because they didn't want corporate attention until they were sure the car made sense. The last thing they wanted was paperwork shutting it down too early. One evening, while testing the car on a small road outside the workshop, Colin said something simple that stuck with people. "It feels right." No charts, no technical briefing, just, "It feels right." Those words became the invisible foundation of the GTO. Not horsepower numbers, not marketing slogans, just a feeling shared among a handful of people who believed drivers deserved more than safe predictability. The human story behind the GTO isn't flashy. It's not made of big confrontations or dramatic moments. It's made of quiet decisions, long nights, tired engineers, shared coffee, small risks, and simple belief. The kind of belief you only get when you're building something you actually care about. By the time the idea finally took shape, Pontiac wasn't just creating a car, they were opening a door. One that would let a whole generation of drivers experience something different on American roads. And none of it started with ego or big promises. It started with people who just wanted to make a better car. Pontiac finally had a car they believed in, but belief alone wasn't enough. They needed someone outside the workshop to feel it too. That's where Jim Wengers stepped in. Wengers wasn't an engineer. He didn't spend his nights tuning carburetors or adjusting suspension. He understood people, what caught their attention, what made them curious, what made them talk about a car before ever sitting in it. And when he first saw the GTO move, he saw something the engineers hadn't focused on. He saw attitude. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, just the way the car sat on the road. Low, planted, confident. The way its front end seemed to lean forward as if it wanted to go, even when standing still. Wengers knew the car needed visibility. Pontiac needed a moment that made people notice, so he arranged something bold for that time, a comparison test with Car and Driver magazine. The idea was simple. Put the GTO next to cars no one expected it to compete with. Cars from Europe, even one with a name that sounded oddly similar. At the time, people didn't compare American midsize cars to anything overseas. They were considered different worlds. But when the GTO landed in front of the journalists, something clicked. The writers didn't see it as a small experiment from Pontiac. They saw it as a car with presence, a car with character, a car that made them want to drive a little farther than the test route required. The article that followed didn't just talk numbers, it talked about feeling. Acceleration that pushed you back a little. A sound that wasn't refined, but honest. A sense that the car wanted to move, even when you didn't ask it to. That article spread fast. It hit the youth market harder than Pontiac expected. Teenagers read it. College students read it. People working factory shifts read it during breaks. The GTO became a topic in parking lots and diners before most dealerships even had one in stock. And then something new started happening. Drag strips filled with GTOs almost overnight. Not the sponsored, big-budget type of racing, just everyday people showing up after work, lining up, and seeing what their car could do. The GTO wasn't a race car, but it made people feel confident enough to try. In American suburbs, the car became a symbol before Pontiac officially realized it. Teenagers would hear one starting down the street and pause their conversations. Neighbors leaned out of driveways just to watch it pass. It wasn't loud in a disrespectful way, just noticeable in a way people remembered. Music was changing too. Rock was growing. Radio stations played new sounds, and young drivers wanted cars that matched that energy. The GTO fit that moment better than any marketing campaign could have planned. At the same time, not everyone liked the shift. Some older Americans didn't understand why anyone needed a car with that much power. Some parents thought it encouraged trouble. And some executives at GM wondered whether Pontiac had gone too far. But for the people who drove it, for the ones who bought it with their first real paycheck, For the ones who saved for months just to feel that engine start, the GTO wasn't a trend. It was freedom in metal form. Before continuing, I remember someone once telling me he bought a GTO right after returning from military service. He said the first time he pressed the accelerator, he felt a moment of calm, like everything around him finally quieted down. Not because the car was fast, but because it gave him something steady to hold on to. Sorry we went off the topics, so let's go back to the topic. So we were on the GTO spreading across America. Dealerships began running out of stock. People were placing orders weeks in advance. Pontiac was surprised, even a little unprepared. They didn't expect the car to rise this fast. The GTO wasn't sold with big promises. It wasn't marketed as a revolution. It was simply offered as an option, a box to check on an order sheet. And that quiet approach made the impact feel even stronger. By 1965, the car had become more than something Pontiac had built. It had become something America had adopted. At drive-ins, people leaned against their cars and talked about the GTO's sound. On long roads, you could hear one approaching before you saw it. In small towns, the car became part of local stories. The fast one, the loud one, the one the kids loved. The GTO wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. It didn't need to be. It matched the energy of a generation growing up fast, trying new things, and finding its own identity. And Pontiac, without planning it, had created the first true American muscle car. The rise of the GTO didn't last untouched. The late 1960s brought a different kind of pressure, not from competitors, but from outside forces that Pontiac couldn't avoid. And slowly, the car that once felt unstoppable began to feel boxed in. At first, it started with insurance companies. Young drivers were buying more powerful cars, accidents were increasing, and insurance companies reacted fast. Premiums went up. Some companies even refused to cover certain high-performance models. It didn't matter how responsible the owner was, the numbers were all they cared about. Then came government regulations. Emission standards were tightening. Fuel efficiency was becoming a concern. Companies were being told to make engines cleaner and quieter. All of this worked directly against the GTO's identity. Pontiac engineers weren't against safety or cleaner air. They just knew these rules made it harder to build cars people connected with emotionally. The 389 engine that once felt natural under the hood now felt like a problem to solve. They tried smaller engines, tuned carburetors differently, and adjusted timing to meet requirements. But every adjustment took a little away from what drivers loved. By the early 1970s, the world was different. Fuel prices were rising. Public opinion was changing. People were talking more about economy and less about power. And the market that once embraced the GTO's personality was starting to fade. Inside Pontiac, morale shifted. The energy that once filled workshops during the GTO's rise wasn't the same. Some engineers moved to other projects. Some felt they were fighting a slow, uphill battle. The car wasn't gone, but it didn't feel like the same car anymore. Pontiac tried to keep it alive. They added design changes, new trims, updated badges. But the heart of the GTO, the part people felt, wasn't as strong. It wasn't their choice. The world was changing faster than the car could. Before continuing, I remember talking to someone who owned a 1973 GTO. He said he loved the car, but he knew it wasn't what the original was. It looked good, he said, but when you started it, you could tell the difference right away. And he wasn't complaining, he was just being honest. Sorry we went off the topics, so let's go back to the topic. So we were on Pontiac struggling to keep the GTO's identity intact. By 1974, the car was different. It had been adapted to meet emissions rules, engines were detuned, the body changed, and the badge, once a symbol people recognized instantly, didn't carry the same weight. The GTO name still existed, but the feeling behind it didn't. Then came 1975, and the decision that many enthusiasts still mention with a slight pause. The GTO name was placed on a compact Pontiac Ventura, a practical car, a reasonable car, just not a GTO in the way people understood. It wasn't a bad car, it just wasn't the car people remembered. Sales dropped, excitement faded, and slowly, the GTO disappeared from new car lots. No farewell, No grand announcement, just a quiet fade-out. But something interesting happened as the car declined. People who owned earlier GTOs didn't let go of them. Instead of giving up, they restored them. They fixed dents, rebuilt engines, collected parts from junkyards, and kept the earlier models alive even when Pontiac couldn't. Some cars weren't going to be forgotten, not while their owners were still around. In small towns and suburbs, the GTO became a memory tied to better days. Not in a dramatic way, just in a quiet, personal way. Someone would hear an engine and say, "Sounds like the old GTO we used to have." Or they'd see one parked and pause a moment longer than they expected, maybe even smile. The turning point for the GTO wasn't a single event. It wasn't one rule, one decision, or one year. It was a slow shift, a combination of regulations, rising costs, insurance pressure, and cultural change. And little by little, the car that once defined a generation found itself out of place in a new one. But even as the production ended, the connection didn't. People still cared. They kept photos, kept stories, kept keys, kept memories. And when a car leaves that kind of mark, it never fully disappears. The GTO's decline wasn't the end of its story. It was the beginning of its legacy. The part where nostalgia starts working harder than horsepower. Even after the GTO disappeared from showrooms, it never really left people's lives. Not the people who grew up around it. Not the ones who saved for it. Not the ones who kept the keys long after the engine stopped running. In towns across America, GTOs sat quietly in garages for years. Some were covered with blankets. Some were pushed against a wall with boxes stacked on top. Some were left outside, slowly fading under sun and rain. But they were never forgotten. Owners talked about them differently than they talked about other cars. They didn't recite specs or brag about horsepower. They talked about moments, first drives, late-night roads, friends who stopped by just to take one more ride. It wasn't about speed, it was about memory. As the 1980s and 1990s came, a new wave started quietly: restoration. People began pulling old GTOs out of barns, sheds, and backyards. Some were barely holding together. Some were covered in rust. Some didn't have engines at all. But every owner talked about them like old friends they wanted to bring back. Restoration shops became small sanctuaries. Mechanics who remembered the cars from their youth took time to rebuild them slowly, piece by piece. They stripped paint, fixed frames, cleaned carbs, rewired harnesses. But the moment every restorer remembers most is the same: when the engine starts again after years of silence. It's not a dramatic sound, more like a tired voice waking up, but people feel it every time. Today, GTO meets still happen in small towns and at big shows. People gather around these cars the same way others gather around old records or vintage cameras. It's not about showing off. It's about remembering a time when driving felt personal, and when cars felt like something you could connect with. Modern drivers who never lived through the 60s still find something honest in the GTO. Maybe it's the shape. Maybe it's the sound. Maybe it's the way it sits on the road, not trying to look perfect, just being what it is. The GTO means different things to different people. To some, it was the car they bought with their first real paycheck. To others, it was the car they borrowed from a sibling or snuck out in when their parents were asleep. And to many, it was just the car they always wished they had. Before continuing, I remember someone saying he kept an old GTO emblem in his drawer for almost 20 years. Not because he needed it, but because every time he saw it, he felt a small reminder of who he used to be. A reminder tied to a car. Sorry we went off the topics, so let's go back to the topic, so we wear on how the GTO stayed alive through its owners. This is the part of the story that matters most. Not the specs, not the marketing, not the numbers, but the people. The ones who didn't let the car fade just because the industry moved on. The ones who kept it running, kept it clean, kept it close. The GTO didn't survive because Pontiac protected it. It survived because people cared enough to keep it alive. They rebuilt engines in the cold, searched junkyards for parts, shared advice across states, and taught each other how to keep the car honest. Cars like the GTO don't disappear. They just move into hands that appreciate them in quieter ways. They become stories, memories, lessons, and sometimes a link between generations. A father hands down tools to a son. An uncle shows a nephew how to adjust timing. A neighbor lets a teenager sit in the driver's seat for the first time. The legacy isn't in the badge, it's in the connection people kept. The GTO is still here because people never stopped feeling something when they saw one. And that emotion, simple, honest, steady, is what kept the car alive long after production ended. We end where we began, in a quiet garage with the same 1964 GTO resting under soft light. Nothing loud, nothing staged, just the car and the space around it. When you look at it now, it doesn't feel like a machine that once shook drag strips or changed a market. It feels calm, almost gentle. Maybe that's the point. Cars don't hold on to the noise of their past. People do. The GTO wasn't the most powerful car ever built. It wasn't the fastest, and it wasn't the most advanced. But it arrived at the right time, for the right generation, and it made people feel something different when they turned the key. Even Pontiac couldn't predict what it would become. They were just trying to make a car young drivers might enjoy. And somehow, that small intention turned into something lasting. Today, when you see a GTO at a small meet or resting in a garage, you can almost sense the layers of its story. The engineers who built it quietly, the drivers who lived with it, the owners who kept it running long after its era ended. A whole circle of people connected by something simple. Before closing, I remember someone once telling me that every time he walked past his old GTO, he'd rest his hand on the fender for a moment. Not to admire it, just to remember who he was when he first owned it. Sorry, we went off the topics, so let's go back to the topic. So we were on the GTO's lasting connection. The car didn't survive because of marketing campaigns or corporate decisions. It survived because people carried its memory forward. One garage at a time, one restoration at a time, one story at a time. And now, it stands as more than a piece of automotive history. It's a reminder of a time when driving felt personal, when cars had their own character, and when something as simple as a key turning in a quiet garage could change the way people felt about the road. As we close this story, the garage light fades a little, and the car settles back into silence. But its place in American memory doesn't fade with it. Not yet. Not for a long time. Because some cars don't just move people, they stay with them.